Amongst the characters from Mother 3 I've neglected to give enough attention, there's a group of characters that I think are extremely deserving of their own video. That's right, Skinhead and Neckbeard. Wait. The Magipsies are some of the most misapprehended characters in probably not just Mother 3, but the entire series too. There's a lot to go over with them, their history and conception, their role in the game, and of course, their reception with players. This though, I want to structure a little differently to my regular analysis videos. Given the subject matter of this video, I do not want to talk over the voices of LGBT folk. I intend to lay out the history of these characters, but I think it'd be significantly more insightful to give insight from my non-cis, non-straight friends. So I did just that. I contacted 3 of my friends who were trans/non-binary, and hardcore fans of Mother 3, to give their opinions and insight when necessary. Those being Wabsabi, Snowwood, and Bismuth Bloom. So thanks to all 3 for their contributions. With that preamble out of the way, let's begin with the Magypsies development. There's 7 of these folks in total, those being Ionia, Aeolia, Doria, Phrygia, Lydia, Mixolydia, and Locria, all named after the 7 modes of the major scale in music theory, by the game's main composer, Shogo Sakai. Regarding their conception as characters, it seems that Shigesato Itoi had at least an inkling of an idea regarding what these characters would be as early as 1996, as Ionia, one of the Magipsies with the most prominence in the final game, appears in a screenshot from then. A couple years later, as development on Mother 3 progressed, some info on Ionia was released through promotional articles on the game called The Mother 3 Times. Through this, we learnt that Ionia was a fortune teller found in the game. The words, her himself, can be found in a promotional image of Ionia, hinting towards their androgyny. Ionia's connection to PSI abilities is also hinted here, as an excerpt from an article reads, "The Mother 3 Times editorial department had the pleasure of interviewing the Orange Kid this month, whose specialities range from fortune-telling to paranormal research. The reporter asked, 'Professor, what exactly is this magic?' The professor responded, 'This magic might be the so-called PSI, but it could be something else entirely. At least, this is what my research tells me so far. So in conclusion, could magic truly be a type of psychic power? Maybe, or maybe not. There's no way to tell right now.' The Professor Orange Kid moniker may seem strange, but given the character here is the same as Ionia as shown in other articles, and they also are described as being a fortune teller, it seemed that the name of Orange Kid was nothing more than a red herring for readers. Anyways, with the N64 version of Mother 3 eventually running out of development time and going unreleased, Mother 3 was reimagined for the GBA beginning in 2002. The main artist, Nobuhiro Imagawa, took the place of the N64 version's main artist, Benimaru Ito, and reimagined the limitations of the sprite size in the final game's art style. And the final design of Ionia is pretty different to both their GBA concept art and the N64 design. As for the other Magipsies, it's not confirmed at all, but some designs for some of the other potential Magipsies show up in a couple of other images. In the files to the final game too, there are leftover prototype designs for Aeolia and Phrygia. The designs for these characters is pretty important, as the final designs are very dissimilar to any other characters in the game. With this in mind, it's interesting to consider how radically different the motif of the prototype designs are versus the final ones. These all are far more explicitly androgynous, while the final designs are more masculine and feminine features mixed together, all the more insinuated with their signature items, that being a razor and lipstick, which at some point in development seemed to be something else entirely different instead. As for their role in the game, here's a rundown. The Magipsies are introduced in the first chapter as friends of the twins' grandfather, Alec. He says they're strange but very nice, and says they're not humans or beasts, or men or women. Flint then meets them and they reveal that his son Klaus visited them just before, and was granted the ability to use strong PSI attacks thanks to them. Here we learn too that all of them are potentially thousands of years old. After this, Ionia in the 4th chapter after the time skip helps in awakening Lucas's PSI abilities. All the Magipsies become relevant again in the 7th chapter, as their role is finally explained. They are the protectors of 7 needles across the Nowhere Islands, which keep a giant magical dragon underneath the surface of said islands in a deep sleep. Once a needle is pulled, the Magipsy assigned to protecting it ceases having a purpose, and subsequently disappears. Conflict arises when the 7th Magipsy, Locria, is missing, and Ionia expresses they don't know where they could be, something hinted to earlier in the game. I'll get back to Locria later. More backstory is given in the 8th chapter, as it's revealed that Kumatora was given to the Magypsies as an infant, and were her only family growing up, giving an interesting perspective on them disappearing. She's having to say goodbye to the only people she could consider her family. The Magypsies' characterization is all very interesting, as there's a variety in how all of them are portrayed. For example, Ionia is the most helpful and level-headed one. Doria is more flamboyant and full of personality, and Aeolia is more sarcastic and high class. But ultimately, they all have similar reactions to their time coming, or in other words, their needles being pulled. They all accept the inevitability that their purpose in life has come to a point where they need to say goodbye, and it's nothing short of fascinating. Seeing as these characters are quite literally inhuman, it's hard to fully grasp what their perspective would be as people who live for thousands of years, but it never feels weird or ham-fisted. It's executed in a way that feels realistic, and you can empathize with not just their emotions, but with Kumatora too. Upon the game's release in April 2006, Shigesato Itoi in a couple of interviews spoke about the Magypsies, and his thoughts on them as characters. For the sake of comprehensiveness, I will read out the questions and answers regarding the Magypsies in full now. As far as the characters go, the Magypsies are amazingly strange. Yes, they're like mixed up chimeras, a fusion of man and woman. Before I first encountered the Magipsies, I was told they're neither man nor woman, nor are they human. That really left it up to my imagination as to what frightening creature I was about to come across. The real credit for that goes to the person who drew the art. They really are some fantastic people. It's because the world in the game is so macho. The good guys in the game are strong and they fight. The same goes to the bad guys. So in other words, it's set up so that might equals right. Power is beautiful, and amid all of that, there are these non-men yet non-women people who have already gone so far as to accept their fate of death. If these characters really existed, I would want people who play Mother 3 not to act hostile towards them. I would want them to have fun together in a world they both share. I can really feel how much you respect the essence of the Magipsies. I really do respect them. I have Magipsy friends of my own. I knew it. It's to the point where I've told how well I understand the Magipsy heart, and how some players were especially moved to tears in the way the Magipsy's sense of beauty differs from the sense of beauty most people adhere to. Only someone like you with such a wide variety of acquaintances could have created such a world. I'm not one of those people, but I really like them a lot, enough that I'd want to be one myself. There's a part where a Magipsy says, "farewell," and then flutters away like a piece of paper. I really like how there's a complete lack of weight. It's almost pitiable, even though they live for over 10,000 years. Speaking of which, when a needle is pulled and a certain Magipsy begins to disappear, he says, "I'm well." By any chance, is that from Kiki's delivery service? Yep, the staff tried to stop me when I wrote that. They said, "If you weren't Shigesato Itoi, we'd have stopped you." There's quite a mysterious ring to the Magipsy names, like Ionia and Phrygia. That was Shogo Sakai's doing. Apparently they're special music terms. Is that true for all of the Magipsies? Even Mixolydia? Really? Think of it as Mr. Sakai's own play on words. Apparently people who know a lot about music find that naming scheme intriguing. Games in the Mother series have adventures to gather melodies, so it's nice to have something similar this time around too. Yes, I wanted to keep the music aspect of it important. Just as I have great respect for the Magipsies, I also feel very happy with the music when I'm playing the game. From this interview, we can infer a lot of things about Shigesato Itoi's process in making these characters. In a similar vein to wanting to represent his physically handicapped friends with Duster, Mr. Itoi wanted to represent his LGBT friends, which he affectionately refers to as his Magipsy friends. You can absolutely tell Mr. Itoi has great respect for people who aren't societally seen as similar to the general public, and that his intentions seem to have involved nothing but admiration and love. Also, as I mentioned before, Shogo Sakai was the one who provided the names for these characters. Mr. Sakai's thoughts on the characters are expanded upon in the Mother 3 liner notes, where he talks about some of the music associated with the Magipsies. I'll read an excerpt now. Out of all the characters in Mother 3, I like the Magipsies the best. I can't get enough of their let it be way of life. What's the garden like by the pink shell where the Magipsies live? I have an image of a Norwegian forest, or perhaps a lakeside with fog in Scandinavia. The baroque atmosphere is rich, elegant, and languid, but then a vulgar and masculine tenor saxophone intervenes. This unlikely combination is the main characteristic of this piece. In a sense, it's a chimera of music. In the game, however, when the Magypsies' body disappears, the tenor sax disappears and only the languid and elegant baroque part remains. Grandpa Alex said the Magypsies were neither a man nor a woman. If the tenor saxophone disappears, then... I won't continue that thought. As you can infer from Mr. Sakai's comments, Mother 3's soundtrack was extremely important to the Magypsies' characterization, which is also something pretty relevant to many of the other characters from this game. Also, he mentions that Aeolia is his favourite Magypsy, interestingly enough. There's also one more behind the scenes piece of info that is relevant enough to cover, but it's something a bit different. It's regarding the Mother 3 fan translation. The Magypsies' dialogue in the translation wasn't entirely handled by Clyde Tomato Mandolin, like most of the rest of the dialogue was. A man named Steve Demeter was enlisted by Tomato, as Demeter was a veteran Mother fan, who was involved with Mother 1's localization unofficially releasing in 1998, the game we now know as Earthbound Beginnings. Mandolin's only demand, according to Demeter,
he wanted me to sass it up, and that's just what I did. Basically, he thought of some of the queens I've met in the Castro as I worked on each character. I could hear their voices in my head, took hold of some of those personas, and put them into the game.
Mandolin wanted Demeter to help out, as Demeter's perspective as a gay man helped in making the English writing for these characters have a better impact. With all of that history and conception being said, I've reached the point in the video where I'd like to share some personal thoughts on the Magypsies from my friends I mentioned before. This, of course, isn't a definitive view of these characters from the Mother fanbase as a whole, but I think getting a sample, albeit small, can shed light on how these characters impacted the people that Mystery Toy would have likened to his Magypsy friends. My first question was, what are your thoughts on their character designs? Do you prefer anything about any of the prototype designs we have access to? My second one was, do you personally see these characters as good LGBT representation? Do you think Mystery Toy and the other developers handled them in a respectful way? And thirdly was, do you think the fan translation did a good job in handling the dialogue for the Magypsies? Here's what they all said. Personally, I love the Magypsies designs, both in the GBA version of Mother 3 and Earthbound 64. Each of their characters as a whole are so much fun, and they're definitely one of my favourite groups of characters in the game. While I can see why some people don't like them or think they're dated, they're never put down by anyone, that I can remember off the top of my head, in-game for how they look or act. I feel like it's really important that nobody in the game is super confused as to who or what they are, because it doesn't matter. I really like Ionia's prototype design from UB64. Their design gives off this wise old man/woman feeling that makes a lot of sense, considering the Magypsies are a major part of the lore of the game. They're mystical beings who know a lot more about the Noah Islands than anyone else does.
I adore these character designs. I've always been a fan of simplistic yet bold and stylish fashion, and their GBA designs deliver on that. Of course, some of that comes from the limitations of pixel art where space is limited to cell design, but their visual presence was a highlight in my first and subsequent playthroughs. The prototype designs, while interesting for being more drawn from fairy-looking aesthetics, doesn't inspire the same love the more dragged look does for me.
Of all versions, I personally believe that the final game features designs that more closely fit and match what Itoy was trying to represent in a lot of other aspects of the game, such as its theming. Itoy has always included characters simply to show that these types of people exist, such as with Tony from Mother 2 or even Duster with Mother 3. This same thing applies to the Magypsies. They exist simply because people like that exist in the real world. I can't make a definitive comment on their Nintendo 64 designs other than that they seem more androgynous, which does work judging by Ionia. While I do love the prototype GBA concept art design, Imagawa goes too close to a sort of fairy tale design that kinda makes them seem less believable as people you'd see in your life. Also on that note, their final designs fit the game greatly. Mother 3, down to its logo, tried to make uncomfortable beauty by combining two things, something that can noticeably be seen in the game's enemy chimeras and its environment.
In my opinion, I think that they're good LGBT representation for the time, because the way they look and act isn't a major defining point of what makes them important to the game. Yeah, they break every aspect of the gender norms within society, but that's not at all the most important thing about them. What's important is their wisdom and how they guide Lucas and the rest of the party to do great things. I'm non-binary myself, which is what I believe the Magypsies to be as well, and I honestly love them. I think Mystery Toy and the devs made them respectful for what the views of being transgender or non-binary were at the time. They were a little dated now, but I still really enjoy their character.
In an indirect way, yes. Their final Game Boy Advance designs heavily resemble a drag aesthetic, and drag is often associated with LGBT people even when the performers may not be queer themselves. In terms of being neither man nor woman, they're doing great. Though the characters will joke, the narrative never treats their existence as jokes, and it's nice to see.
This is an interesting question. The Magipsies are supposed to represent cross-dressers and those people that Itoi knows about, yet I believe that a lot of the times they can come off as a really good trans allegory, and I believe in heart and writing that they are good in terms of LGBTQ representation. Despite much of the chimera symbolism in the game being shown off in a negative light, the Magypsies are supposed to be the exact opposite of this. They're supposed to symbolize that power is beautiful, and are some of the most important people in the game's story, helping Lucas and Co awaken the Dark Dragon. Another interesting thing about the Magypsies is how the designs influence their own music, as mentioned earlier from Shogo Sakai.
I do think the fan translation did a good job in handling their dialogue for the most part. I don't speak any Japanese whatsoever, but I think how they translated their original dialogue from what I've seen is fine. I enjoy how flamboyant and fun they are. They feel like really accepting people.
Yes, each Magypsy oozes inhuman personality and ethereal flair. You feel they view the world in a very different way due to the nature of their existence, and the unabashed eccentricity is fun to read.
I believe the fan translation does a good job with its representation of the Magypsies in terms of their writing. Steve Demeter, who you might recognize as the founder of Neo Demiforce, was put in charge of writing the dialogue for the Magypsies, most likely due to Demeter being a gay man. While I believe that Demeter's work on the dialogue is incredible and helps bleed their LGBTQ-ness in terms of the English fan translation, I feel as though the inconsistency of their pronouns is one thing that I feel could have been easily worked on. Fan translation switches between the two when they could have easily made it more consistent.
I hope that was able to shed some insight on some of the impact of these characters. That of course isn't all, however. I still have 3 more questions, but there's more specific points of analysis I need to be going over before I can get to them. That is to say, it's time to address the elephant in the room. Found within Mother 3 is a specific scene that many people find particularly contentious. This being the scene where Lucas has PSI abilities awakened by Ionia. The scene features both Lucas and Ionia together in a hot spring, and shows no visuals for most of it, as Ionia tells him to not struggle and endure it. The scene then shows Lucas emerging his head from the water, and shows he's now unlocked his psychic potential. The scene is vague, to the point where many different people had differing reactions to it. It is what I consider, unfortunately, a scene wrongly used as a poster boy for why Mother 3 doesn't have an official worldwide release. Regardless, this scene is infamously known as something strange amongst a lot of people who played this game. And honestly, I didn't have much of a clue until recently why exactly they would decide to put in a scene like this into the game. In fact, something of interest too is that it's very possible Lucas was supposed to gain his psychic powers in a slightly different way. Contained within the files to the game is an animation of Lucas being zapped by lightning while in a hot spring. Mother 3 has a couple of instances of characters learning PSI through being zapped by lightning, so it's possible that this was the original intended way Lucas was also going to learn his PSI. This potential change to me comes off as peculiar, because why put something that is unclear as to what's occurring and off-put players, as opposed to something that better shows what's going on? My thoughts on the hot spring scene pretty much remain that way until someone in the Earthbound 64 server provided a theory on what the scene was potentially meant to accomplish, and this interpretation was so insightful in my opinion, that's actually the reason why I wanted to make this entire video. A user in that server called Lost My Head left this analysis. It goes as follows. The scene is that way because Itoi wants the player to confront their own transphobic bias. You're never supposed to know what happens. It's supposed to make you distrust Ionia based off you only overhearing something out of context. You build your own image, and that is a reflection of your own thoughts. I was pretty blown away by such an interesting way to look at this scene that I hadn't once considered prior, and responded with, Itoi has mentioned in at least one interview he wanted Mother 3 to be a mirror, reflecting the heart of the player back at them. This could have been one of those things he meant. Some more discussion occurred, and another user, Last Loser, went on to say, I get where you are coming from, but whenever I see someone play through the game, their reactions seem to be along the lines of, oh god, what? So I don't think the scene did a good job at showing the other side of things. Which, for full clarification, I think it's perfectly valid to also feel that way about the scene. Lost My Head provided some more of her insight in response, and went on to say, but that is the point, specifically. Everyone who reacts that way is showing their own transphobic bias, whether or not that's subtle bigotry, by them not being trans, or them harboring internalized transphobia, defined by them being trans and feeling the trauma. The point is to make the player feel transphobia, and then never elaborate on it, to let you work on your own thoughts to overcome in your own ways. I've been trans for over 2 decades, and I will explain this to as many people as possible, hopefully not sounding too stressful. And that is so interesting to me. We may never fully know what Mystery Toy's intentions were with that specific scene, unless he goes and states them in an interview at some point. But if his intentions were to at all be anything along the lines of what Lost My Head described, then that's so interesting to think about. Of course, I don't want to give too much of my opinion here, and wanted to know what some others thought, so I showed this analysis from Lost My Head to my friends from before, as well as asked them for their overall thoughts on the hot spring scene, and the cut Lucas sprites, and this is what they all had to say. When I first played Mother 3, I didn't even notice what the hot spring could have been interpreted as. I just thought Ionia was helping Lucas in some way. I do feel like it could have been Mystery Toy's way of having the player build their own opinion on the Magipsies based on this interaction between Ionia and Lucas, though their opinion of just one of them could affect how they view the others. I know a few people believe the context that we never see to be sexual, but I don't think that was the intention. I'm not sure why the way Lucas obtains PSI was changed. To be fair, I'm not educated on the specifics of pre-GBA lore as much as other fans of EB64.
When I first played Mother 3, the hot spring scene didn't stand out to me much, even as someone with a bit of paranoia over subtext I could be missing. By taking away sight, it left what happened far more up to interpretation, as that member said. For those it stands out to, it can be a good reflection of their fears. I can't know what was intended, nor if this were changed for a particular reason. All I can see is something that'll be a mystery, leaving people open to fear if they're predisposed to fear of the unknown.
In terms of the hot spring scenes, I know that many people saw it as extremely inappropriate, suggesting something uncomfortable like and that stuff. I never saw it as that during my first playthrough as a kid, though I never really understood what it was supposed to imply to begin with. I think the theory brought up by that user is an interesting way of viewing things, but I believe that isn't the prime intention. Something that makes PSI this time different from any game prior to this is the way it's acquired, which Itoy compares to menstruation. I believe PSI in Mother 3 is supposed to, as a whole, represent puberty, with the sweating representing the uncomfortableness of the changes puberty brings. I also feel like this extends to the hot spring scene, which Mr. Itoy comments on.
In the future, if I happen to live to be 90 years old, I want one of those kids who played the game to come to me as a grown-up and say, "A long time ago in 3rd grade, I played Mother 3. I was really nervous and confused about what was going on in the hot spring in that tunnel, and that's what led me to the place I am today."
This comment makes it very clear that there's a connection between a child growing up and that specific hot spring scene. In a sense, the hot spring scene is supposed to be Lucas entering puberty, in a sense of how Kumatora has been going through it for the last few years. I don't believe this is a radical change from development, as growing up has been an integral part of Mother 3's stories since almost the beginning of development.
I almost forgot to bring this up for this video, but Lost My Head also made another interesting comment that got me thinking. A lot of people also miss the beginning of Chapter 7, when Ionia joins your party. You can take the boat to Aeolia's house, but if you instead walk through town, every villager will have a comment about your new friend. Those comments are astounding because they show the player just how different kinds of people think in different ways about queer-looking folks. This is very much something true. A lot of people miss this dialogue in Tasmili Village, and as she wrote, yeah, it really does give so much insight onto how different players will view people who don't societally look normal. It's just such amazing detail for something a lot of players miss. You might not be surprised I'm bringing this up, but the cut post-time skip Flint cameos actually have some dialogue regarding this. Speaking to Flint with Ionia in your party prompts him to tell Lucas to not cause too much trouble for Ionia. I bring this up because it's interesting that the payoff of Flint learning that the Magypsies could have stopped Klaus from going off to fight the Mecha Drago did not result in Flint being bitter towards them and holding a grudge. He instead treats Ionia like a regular person, only asking for Lucas to not cause too much burden for them. How very interesting. There's just so much that can be said about this little game, huh? Well, I'm still not done. There's probably something that some of you may have considered missing from this video. Yeah, it's time to talk about Facade. Facade is an extremely interesting character. I can't emphasize enough just how crazy it is that it seems no one ever sees it coming that he's Lokria, the missing 7th Magypsy. Facade is immediately introduced as unlikable, he's willing to harm others for his own sake, as demonstrated with all of Chapter 3 with Salsa. He's conniving, slimy, and rotten. In other words, he's the antithesis of all the other Magypsies. I think it would possibly do him a disservice to try and psychoanalyze Facade's character in this one section of a video rather than perhaps give him his own standalone video, but my main point about him I feel necessary to bring up in this video is why he does what he does. When Porky went on his diatribe about toying with the Nowhere Islands due to his crippling boredom of being so old, and then I begun to think back on Facade, it all clicked. Facade, like the other Magypsies, would be living out an extremely long lifespan. It's likely, in my view, that the reason Facade agreed to help Porky is because he felt similar apathy from having been alive for so long. Facade's differences and disconnect from the other Magypsies is all the more symbolized with his original name, Locrian, as the Locrian mode is considered to be dissonant compared to the other 6 modes. While the other Magypsies choose to be selfless and kind, Facade decided to betray those virtues. What an interesting character. Naturally, as with the other points of discussion in this video, I asked my friends about their thoughts on Facade, and more specifically, if they felt he figuratively represented anything. Here's what they said. I think Facade was, honestly, trying to go against everything the Magypsies stood for. All of the Magypsies are considered to be genderless, yet he dressed as and referred to himself as a man. I can't really describe what I think he represented as a character in words, because it's very complex and based on my own feelings on being non-binary, but I basically think he was meant to be an opposite to the other Magypsies.
Facade is dissonance. While Itoy didn't name him Locrian, the name spells out the rebellion against what the Magypsies stood for no matter the cost to those around them. It's unfortunate for everyone, including themselves. Perhaps a cautionary tale of greed, not of rebellion itself.
I believe Facade is supposed to represent a lot of things, but one of those smaller things might be that anybody can be a Magypsy, even if it isn't obvious. I know one of the biggest shocks in Mother 3 is that Facade is Locrian, the 7th Magypsy, despite never looking or hinting that at all. Locrian/Facade's room can kinda hint to believe that the clothes Locrian has is just how they look. Despite not looking like one, they are in fact a Magypsy. Maybe they're ashamed of who they are and don't want people to know that? It's really up for interpretation.
With all of that having been said, with all of that insight too from some of my LGBT friends, I think it goes to show that not everyone is going to view characters in media the same way. People are going to take away different meanings, especially so when you leave a lot of details out and let the player come up with their own interpretation. And when it comes to LGBT representation, even if something on the surface may seem a bit strange, if it can truly instill a player to think about something they hadn't once considered, to learn more about the world and how people from everywhere and anywhere are, and how they want to express themselves, then I think you have created something that not only is entertaining, but also thoughtful and inspiring. And time again, Mother 3 has proven to be just that. To conclude, I also asked my friends what their personal favourite Magypsies were. Here's what they all said. My favourite Magypsy is Mixolydia. I love how during the events of Tane Tane Island, Lucas and the party view them as a beautiful woman. I also like how her way of helping the party and other people affected by the mushroom hallucinations is by hitting them over the head with a 2x4. Their pet octopus is also cute.
Hey Olia! I've always thought their outfit was by far the most interesting, and they have a really powerful presence within their chair.
This is an extremely hard question. I think I love all of them equally, but if I had to really pick one, then the one that's always stuck out to me since I was a kid was Doria. I think it might be their animations, the way they talk about each of the Chimera trying to get the water out, the reaction of pulling out the needles especially. If there's something that I love with the Magypsies is that they do not see death as bad, but instead a celebration of fate. They are accepting of death, which is something beautiful that I feel a lot of media doesn't seem to do.
As for me, Ione is my favourite one. They're the most interesting character amongst the Magypsies, only followed up by Facade. But anyways, I've made it to the end of this video. What did I want to accomplish with this? Well, it was to hopefully shed insight on these fascinating and amazing characters, and give them the analysis they deserve. If I managed to accomplish this to any capacity, I think I've done my job. I want to thank everyone who was imperative in this video's creation. Without you all, I would not be here to talk about this. If you have any thoughts at all about this video, the Magypsies, or anything about Mother 3, please leave a comment. I love reading the discussion that a lot of you come up with in the comments to my Mother 3 analysis videos. Be sure to do the usual YouTube things, like, subscribe, and share, and thanks for watching y'all. Bye.